The stone was older than any living thing in the galaxy. It sat in a broken room on a dead world called Vel Sarath, buried under 60 meters of gray ash. Oran had been digging for 3 weeks when his tool hit something solid. He brushed it clean with his 4 thin fingers and held his lamp close. The markings were deep, carved with something harder than the stone itself. He recognized the script immediately. Elder Solhari, a civilization that had been gone for 80,000 years. He read it slowly, translating word by word in his head. When the soft ones from the blue world wake to war, seal your gates. They do not fight to conquer, they fight to finish. Oran sat back on his heels and said nothing for a long time. Outside, the wind moved dead dust across dead ground. He was alone on this world except for his 2 assistants, both asleep in the crawler. He read the inscription again. Then he took photographs of every surface, packed his tools, and sent an urgent message to the Grand Council of Races before the crawler had even started moving. The council met on Sarath Prime, in a chamber carved from a single piece of blue mineral that hummed faintly when more than 10 beings stood inside it. 7 races sat at the curved table. Myrth of the Duvari, whose people had 4 arms and spoke in layered tones that carried 2 meanings at once. Sok of the Grethoni, a stone-skinned giant who rarely moved but missed nothing. Palace of the Viren, who existed partly as light and partly as pressure, and who flickered when agitated. The others were quieter, smaller civilizations who mostly listened. Oran presented his findings from a standing platform. He showed the photographs. He showed his translation. He showed the geological dating confirming the inscription was 80,000 years old. When he finished, Pallas flickered 3 times in rapid succession, which was the Viren equivalent of a sharp laugh. "A rock," Pallas said. "You brought us here for a rock." "A rock carved by a civilization that saw something and felt the need to warn every race that came after," Oran said. "That is worth the trip." Sok had not moved. His stone-gray eyes were fixed on the projected image of the inscription. "The Solhari observed hundreds of worlds before they vanished," he said. His voice came out slow and low, like boulders settling. "They did not carve things without reason." "They also went extinct," Pallas said. "Did they?" said Elder Dawn. The room went quiet. Dawn was the oldest living Duvari, which made her one of the oldest living beings in the known galaxy. She sat at the far end of the table and had not spoken until now. Her 4 eyes were fixed on the projection. "We assume they died," she said. "We found no survivors, but we also found no bodies, no catastrophe, no war damage. They simply stopped being present." She paused. "That is a different thing from extinction." No one answered that. The meeting moved on to the second topic, which had arrived in the council's inbox only 4 days before Oran's message. A probe had crossed into monitored space at the edge of the Orion Spur. It was crude by any modern standard, powered by a chemical drive and carrying a radio signal that looped on a 40-second cycle. The signal had been decoded quickly. It was simple. "We know we are not alone. We are ready to meet you." The probe had originated from a small blue world orbiting a yellow star, 3rd planet from the Sun. The planet had been under passive observation for 2 centuries. Its people were carbon-based, bilaterally symmetric, warm-blooded, and had spent most of recorded history fighting each other over land, resources, and ideas. They had achieved nuclear capability, nearly destroyed themselves twice, and then about 40 years ago, done something no observed civilization had ever done before. They stopped. Not completely, not perfectly, but they signed a unified planetary charter, disbanded most of their national military structures, and redirected their combined industrial output towards space development. In 40 years, they had gone from burning fossil fuels to launching deep space probes. The speed of it was not normal. Nothing about the progression was normal. Sok finally moved. He turned his head slowly toward Dawn. "You think the inscription and the probe are connected?" "I think the Solhari watched this world a very long time ago," Dawn said. I think they saw what was coming, and I think they left a note. Palace flickered again, but said nothing this time. Oran looked at the two images side by side on the projection wall, the ancient warning carved in stone, the simple radio signal from a blue world learning to reach outward. He had spent his life studying dead civilizations, reading the last words of peoples who had run out of time. He was good at recognizing when something was about to change. The council voted to send an envoy, not their best diplomat, not their fastest ship, a mid-tier delegation because the humans were new and unproven and did not need to be treated as equals. Oran voted against the decision. He was overruled. He went back to Vel Sareth the next day. He had a feeling there was more to find. He was right. 3 meters below the first slab, his tool struck another stone. This one was longer. The carvings were finer, more careful, like whoever made them had taken their time. He translated the opening line and felt something cold move through him. We built them small obstacles to slow them. They solved each one and thanked us for the practice. He sat in the ash and read it twice. Then he called Elder Dawn directly, bypassing the council entirely. She answered on the first signal. She had been waiting. The neutral station had no name. It existed in the space between two systems, owned by no one, claimed by no one, maintained by a rotating crew of Duvari engineers who kept it running and asked no questions. It was chosen because it was boring. The council believed boring was safe. Envoy Saul arrived first. He was Grethoni, which meant he was large, slow-moving, and extremely difficult to surprise. His species had been in space for 6,000 years. They had seen first contacts before. New species were always the same, he believed. Frightened, impressed, eager to please. He set up his delegation in the main hall and waited. The human shuttle docked 40 minutes early. Saul noted this. Punctuality was a form of communication. Arriving early meant they had calculated the journey time precisely and then built in a buffer. That was not the behavior of a nervous species. That was the behavior of a species that did not like to be caught unprepared. The airlock opened and 4 humans walked in. They wore simple dark clothing with no decoration. No ceremonial dress, no visible weapons, no display of rank beyond a small pin on each collar. Saul had been briefed that the lead diplomat was named Aiden. He was a middle-aged male, average height, with gray at the edges of his dark hair and eyes that moved steadily around the room when he entered, taking inventory. Aiden stopped at a comfortable distance, inclined his head, and greeted Saul in Grethoni. Not translated Grethoni, not accent-heavy approximated Grethoni. Clean, grammatically correct, properly toned Grethoni, with the formal register used between equals. Saul's second-in-command, a younger Grethoni named Das, shifted his weight slightly. Saul did not move, but something inside him recalibrated. "You learned our language," Saul said, "in the common trade tongue." "We learned several," Aiden said, switching to trade tongue without hesitation. "We were not sure which delegation would be sent." They sat. The meeting proceeded according to the agreed agenda. Exchange of identification, exchange of planetary data, exchange of basic biological and historical records. Standard protocol. Saul had run this meeting a dozen times with a dozen species. It was usually awkward. Humans were not awkward. They were attentive, precise, and impossible to read. Saul's team had been authorized to run a small series of comfort tests during the meeting. These were standard practice when encountering new species. Small environmental adjustments to measure stress responses. The station's systems quietly raised the room temperature by 4 degrees, then shifted the lighting spectrum toward the ultraviolet edge, which most species found faintly uncomfortable, then reduced gravity by 8%. The humans noticed every change. Saul could see it in the way their posture shifted, the way their eyes moved, but none of them said anything. None of them complained or asked for adjustment. They simply adapted and kept talking. This was, Saul realized, somehow more unsettling than if they had complained. Aiden placed a data drive on the table and slid it across. "Our history," he said, "complete, unedited. We were told you would appreciate transparency." Saul picked it up. His team would review it later. "We will share ours in return," he said. "We have already reviewed yours," Aiden said. "Publicly available records. We wanted to understand who we were meeting." Das shifted again. Saul kept his expression neutral. The history drive contained everything. Aiden had not been exaggerating. Every war, every atrocity, every famine, plague, and internal collapse. Other civilizations, when making first contact, presented their best moments. Their art, their achievements, their golden ages. Humans had sent everything, the beautiful and the terrible in equal measure, with dates and numbers attached. Saul reviewed portions of it that evening in his quarters. 400 million dead in the Third Resource War. Then, 40 years later, a global charter signed by every surviving nation. He read the charter's opening line 3 times. "We have seen what we are. We choose to be something else." He sent his report to the council that night. His hands, which were stone gray and had never trembled in 6,000 years of diplomatic service, were very slightly unsteady when he typed. "They are not afraid of us. They are studying us. Their history is not a record of a civilization that struggled to survive. It is a record of a civilization that learned, very slowly and at enormous cost, how to aim itself. I do not believe they sent the probe because they were lonely. I believe they sent it because they were ready." Back on Soreth Prime, the council read Saul's report in session. Palace flickered rapidly. Several of the smaller races said nothing, which was their way of being frightened. Oran was not at the meeting. He was still on Vel Sarath, still digging. He had found a third inscription and a fourth, and now a gallery of them, all carved by different hands at different times, spread across thousands of years. Different dead civilizations had come to this world and added their own lines to the same warning. Like a book written by a dozen authors who never met, all saying versions of the same thing. He was photographing the newest section when his light caught something carved lower on the wall. Smaller letters, rougher cuts, like they had been added in a hurry. He translated them slowly. "They grieve like no other species we have observed. They grieve loudly, completely, and then they stand up. We do not know how they stand up. We have tried to understand it. We cannot. This is the thing that frightens us most." Oran sat with that for a long time. He thought about the 400 million dead. He thought about the charter signed 40 years later. He thought about Aiden walking off a shuttle on a foreign station and greeting an alien diplomat in his own language, calm and prepared and ready. He photographed the inscription. Then he kept digging. The leak came from the last place the council expected. As was a Viren research fellow at the Grand Archive, small even by Viren standards, existing as a faint amber light that most beings walked past without noticing. As had spent 11 years cataloging the inscriptions Oran had been sending back from Vel Sorath. He had read every line. He had cross-referenced them with records from 4 other dead worlds where similar carvings had since been found. He had written a paper that the council quietly shelved without comment. He sent a copy to Aiden. Not through official channels. Through a Viren courier service that asked no questions, addressed to the human delegation's secondary contact address, with a short note attached. "You deserve to know what others have written about you." Aiden read the full archive of inscriptions in a single sitting. Then he walked to Admiral Ray's office and placed the documents on her desk without a word. Ray was not a dramatic person. She read everything slowly from beginning to end, and when she finished she was quiet for a while. Outside the window behind her desk, an Earth shipyard worked through the night cycle, bright and loud and relentless. 3 new fleet vessels were being assembled simultaneously. They had been under construction for 8 months. "How many races went extinct before they wrote these?" she said finally. Aiden did not answer because there was no good answer. Dozens, maybe more. Keep the leak quiet, she said. Thank the Viren privately, and move our construction schedule forward by 6 months. That will be noticed, Aiden said. Yes, Ray said, it will. She did not say it as a threat. She said it the way she said most things, factually, without decoration. This was what made her difficult to argue with. Aiden left and Ray returned to the documents, reading the oldest inscriptions again. The Solhari words, the ones about obstacles and practice. She wrote one line in her personal log before going to sleep. They were afraid of us and they still tried to help. Remember that. 2 weeks later, a Grethoni patrol vessel in the outer belt fired on a human cargo hauler. The cargo hauler was carrying medical equipment to a frontier settlement. 2 crew members died in the hull breach before the emergency seal held. The Grethoni vessel sent a short transmission, calling it a navigation accident, and left. Ray received the incident report at 400 station time. She read it twice. She opened the fleet positioning display and quietly moved 3 full divisions toward the outer belt perimeter. No announcement, no press statement, no message to the council. She filed the standard incident report through official channels and requested a formal review, using every correct procedural form in the correct order. Saul, who was still aboard the neutral station finishing secondary diplomatic talks with Aiden, received a copy of the repositioning data from a Duvari observer satellite. He stared at it for a long time. Then he sent another private message to the council, separate from his official reports. Note, human fleet movement after the belt incident was not reactive, it was positional. They did not move toward the aggressor. They moved to a location that changes the strategic geometry of the entire outer region. This was calculated before the bodies were cold. I want to be very clear about what I mean. They did not react in anger. They responded in silence. There is a difference and it matters. Oran read this message 3 days later when Don forwarded it to him, along with a personal note. Come home. Bring everything you have found. He had found a great deal. 31 separate inscriptions from 11 distinct extinct civilizations, all referencing the same blue world, all written across an 80,000-year span. And one other thing, found deepest in the excavation, in a sealed chamber that had taken his team 4 days to cut open. A survival log, Solhari, not an inscription, not a warning, a personal record written by someone who had clearly been very frightened and very methodical at the same time. The log described what they had seen, a young species on a blue world, still primitive, still tribal. But the Solhari had watched them for a long time and noticed something that no other observed species had ever displayed. Humans learned from catastrophe at a rate that should not have been biologically possible. Most species recovered slowly from disaster, psychologically as well as physically. Humans recovered fast, and each time they recovered they built something slightly harder to destroy than what they had before. The log writer had done the mathematics, projections based on observed growth rates. At the end of the projection, they had written 4 words and then apparently stopped recording. Oran translated them carefully, checked the translation twice, and then sat in the sealed chamber alone for 20 minutes before he called Don. The 4 words were, "We chose to leave." Not extinct, not destroyed, a choice. The Solhari had looked at the projections, looked at the blue world, understood what was going to emerge from it, and decided that the wisest thing they could do was remove themselves from the equation. They had run. Not in panic, Oran thought. In respect, or maybe in something between respect and fear that did not have a word in any language he knew. On Earth that same week, a secondary resource crisis developed in the northern agricultural zones. Projections suggested it could affect food supply for 200 million people within 18 months. The Human Global Coordination Network activated immediately. 11 days later, the crisis was resolved through redirected supply chains, emergency agricultural expansion, and 3 new water reclamation facilities. The Council's observation satellites recorded the entire process. At the next session, the smallest representative, a Duvari junior delegate named Foss, raised one hand and asked quietly, "Has any species ever solved a resource crisis in 11 days?" No one answered. Because no one had, the attack on Torren's Rest began at local dawn. The colony had been established for 9 years on a warm world 2 light years from the outer belt. 600,000 people lived there, mostly families of miners, engineers, and the support workers who kept frontier settlements running. There were 32 schools, a small hospital, a football league with 8 teams, the kind of place that grew slowly and quietly and asked nothing of anyone. The Grethoni hardline faction had been planning the strike for 4 months. They called themselves the Stone Fist, which was considered poetic in Grethoni culture. Their argument within the internal debates of their people was straightforward: establish dominance before humans become impossible to dominate. A demonstration. Hit something meaningful, watch humanity scramble, prove the inscriptions were fear writing from weak dead civilizations, and negotiate from a position of power afterward. They brought 6 warships. Against a colony with 2 defense platforms and 1 patrol cutter, this was not a fight. It was a statement. The first strike took out the defense platforms. The second strike hit the main power grid. The colony went dark. The Stone Fist commander sent a transmission to his government and to the council simultaneously, declaring that Torren's Rest was now under Grethoni protective administration, pending resolution of outstanding territorial disputes. He expected silence from Earth for at least 3 days. Deep space communication was slow. Mobilization was slower. He estimated he had a week before any human response vessel could reach the system. The first human fleet element arrived in 5 hours and 40 minutes. This was not possible. The mathematics did not allow it. Ships did not move that fast, except that the human vessels had not come from Earth. They had come from 6 different prepositioned locations, none of which the Grethoni faction had known about because the humans had been positioning ships quietly in the outer regions for 2 months, ever since Ray had moved the divisions after the Belt incident. Not pointed at anyone, just present, just there. The Stone Fist commander had 6 warships. When the human fleet finished arriving, he counted 41. He had never seen human warships up close before. They were not elegant. Grethoni ships were carved smooth, built for appearance as much as function, because Grethoni believed how you looked when you arrived told others who you were. Human ships looked like they had been designed by someone who had never once thought about appearance and only thought about what the ship needed to do. They were angular and dense, covered in sensor arrays and point defense clusters and things whose function he could not identify. They looked like they had been built by people who expected to be hit and had planned for every way it could happen. Ray's voice came through on all frequencies at once. She did not shout. She spoke the way she always spoke, at a steady pace, clearly, without extra words. You have struck a civilian settlement. You will withdraw your vessels now. You will not fire again. Any crew requiring medical assistance will receive it. Any vessel that powers down weapons and holds position will not be engaged. You have 10 minutes. The Stone Fist commander contacted his government. His government contacted the council. The council contacted Don, who was the only senior member anyone trusted in a moment like this, and Don said only, "I told you, now stop it." The Stone Fist commander surrendered in 7 minutes. The battle, such as it was, lasted less than 30 hours in total, including 2 engagements when a pair of Grethoni vessels tried to run, and were stopped by human intercept craft that had been waiting at the exit vectors. The human fleet commanders had positioned themselves not just to fight, but to prevent escape, which was a level of planning that implied they had modeled the entire engagement before the first shot was ever fired. The colony was secured. Ray's medical teams were on the ground within 3 hours of the Grethoni surrender, working alongside the colony's own emergency services. 214 colonists had been injured. 11 were dead. Ray had their names read aloud at the full fleet assembly before she gave any tactical orders. Then she did the thing that no one expected. She ordered full medical assistance provided to every Grethoni crew member. She ordered safe passage home for every surrendered vessel. She assigned a human escort to make sure they got there without being harassed by other alien powers who might see opportunity in the moment. She sent a formal message to the Grethoni government, separating the Stone Fist faction from the Grethoni people as a whole, stating clearly that humanity's response was targeted and not general. 3 minor alien races watched all of this happen in real time through their observer satellites. Within 48 hours, all 3 had sent formal requests for alliance talks with the human delegation. Pallas, watching from Sarath Prime, flickered so rapidly that the other council members moved their chairs back. This was planned, Pallas said. Every part of it, the positioning, the response time, the medical aid, the message to the Grethoni government, this was not a reaction, this was a demonstration. Yes, said Don quietly, but notice what they chose to demonstrate. Nobody spoke for a moment. They could have destroyed those 6 ships, Sock said finally. His stone voice was slower than usual. They could have destroyed more than that, Don said. Oran, sitting in the back of the room as a non-voting observer, looked down at the translated inscription in his notes. The one about obstacles and practice. The one about grief and standing up. He thought the Solhari would have recognized exactly what they had just seen. Not a species losing control of itself. A species showing control it had been developing for 40 years, maybe longer. Knowing what it was capable of. Choosing the smaller action. Holding the larger one in reserve, visible but unspoken, like a word that did not need to be said because everyone in the room already knew it. Ray filed her after-action report that night. It was 12 pages. The final line read, "Torren's rest is secure. We are ready for whatever comes next." Dawn traveled to the human flagship alone. She told no one on the council. She took a single Duvari transport, filed a private flight plan, and arrived at the coordinates Aiden had provided with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been making difficult decisions for a very long time and no longer needed company while doing it. She was 140 years old, which was elderly even for Duvari. She moved slowly. She noticed everything. The airlock opened and Aiden met her personally, with no guards. This was unusual. Every species used guards during new contact. It was practically a law of the galaxy. Aiden simply stood there in the corridor and inclined his head and asked if she needed anything after the journey. "I need to speak with Admiral Ray," Dawn said. "She is expecting you," Aiden said. Ray's office was not impressive. Dawn had expected something of a conqueror, some display of power or achievement, plaques on the wall or maps showing fleet positions. Instead, the room held a desk, 2 chairs, a small window showing open space, and a shelf of physical books. Physical books were an interesting choice on a spaceship where every gram of mass had a cost. Dawn noted this. Ray stood when she entered and gestured to one of the chairs. Then she did something Dawn had not anticipated. She made tea. Not as ceremony, not as performance. She simply turned to a small heating unit on the shelf and made 2 cups of something warm and placed one in front of Dawn and sat down. Her hands were steady. Her attention was complete. "You read the inscriptions," Dawn said. "All of them," Ray said. "Oran's full archive. We have our own translations now." And Ray looked at her tea for a moment. "The Solhari watched us when we were young," she said. "They saw what was in us and they were afraid. I understand that. We were afraid of ourselves for a long time." She paused. 400 million people died in the Third Resource War. I know that number because we counted. We count everything, every single one. Dawn waited. "We remember what we are capable of," Ray said. "That is why we are careful." Dawn had prepared several questions for this meeting. she found she did not need most of them. "The Council believes you want to rule the galaxy," she said. "The Council is wrong," Ray said simply. "We want to make it harder for anyone to be destroyed alone." Dawn held her cup in her four-fingered hands and thought about that sentence for a while. "Palace is building a coalition," she said. "I know," said Ray. 12 races, perhaps more. "I know that too. They are frightened of you." Ray nodded slowly. "I know, I would be frightened of us too." She looked at the window. "We spent 10,000 years being frightened of each other, and we turned that fear into the worst things you can imagine. And then we decided to do something different with it." She turned back to Dawn. "Fear is not the problem. What you do with it is the problem." Dawn left the flagship 3 hours later with a great deal to think about. She had gone looking for a general and found a person who had read every word of the ancient warnings about her own species and responded not with defensiveness but with recognition. Back on Sareth Prime, the coalition was taking shape faster than anyone had managed to slow it down. Pallas had been effective. The argument was simple and it worked on frightened minds. Humanity was too capable, too unified, too fast, too prepared. Left alone, they would eventually dominate everything whether they meant to or not. The solution was a unified front, a show of force, a clear line drawn before the line became impossible to draw. 12 warfleets. Combined, it was the largest military gathering in recorded galactic history. Aiden had been working quietly on a different solution. He had spent 2 weeks in private talks with the coalition's more uncertain members, offering them the outline of a joint peacekeeping framework. Shared authority, shared responsibility, a structure where no single species made decisions alone. Several had been interested. Several had pulled back when Pallas applied pressure. Ray watched the coalition assemble from the flagship's tactical display. She said nothing for 3 days. Her officers waited. She was known for this, for the silences before decisions. No one interrupted them. On the 4th day, she issued a single fleet order. Every human ship in the outer regions went dark. All signals stopped. All active systems powered down or shielded. The Sol system went quiet. From the outside looking in, there was nothing to see. No ships, no stations broadcasting, nothing. The coalition fleet left their staging point and moved toward Earth. They traveled for 2 days through complete silence. No response to hails. No sensor returns. Empty space. The coalition commander, a Grethoni admiral named Proth who had voted against the operation from the start but followed orders, watched his displays and felt the silence the way you feel weather before it arrives. Then Ray's voice came through on every frequency simultaneously, not transmitted from any single point, from all around them at once. "You are currently surrounded. We have observed you since you left your staging point. We know your formation, your fuel states, your communication codes, and the name of every commander in your fleet." A pause. "We do not want this. We have never wanted this. You may leave now, or you may learn why the old races carved those warnings in stone." Proth looked at his display. It was still showing empty space. He ran active sensors at full power. 41 contacts resolved, then 60, then more. They had been there the whole time, waiting, invisible, patient. He counted to 10 in his head. Then he sent the withdrawal order. Pallas did not surrender. Pallas simply changed his mind, which in Viren culture was considered a sign of intelligence rather than weakness. He arrived at the human diplomatic station 3 days after the coalition withdrew, flickering at the calm amber frequency that meant he wanted to talk without being recorded. Aiden met him alone. The conversation lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Pallas left without announcing what had been discussed, and Aiden went directly to his desk and spent the rest of the night writing the framework he had been outlining for 3 weeks. By morning it had a name, the Galactic Defense Compact. The core of it was simple. No single species made security decisions for others. Threats were assessed collectively. Responses were agreed by vote with a qualified majority. Humanity would contribute the largest military capacity as they had the largest fleet, but they would hold no more votes than anyone else. In exchange, every member race would share intelligence, open their borders to joint patrols, and commit to collective defense. The council session that ratified the compact was the longest in its history, 40 hours of continuous debate. Saul spoke for 3 hours and never raised his voice. Don said almost nothing and voted first. Pallas flickered constantly, which meant he was still processing, but he voted yes. Even the smallest races, the ones who had spent the whole crisis sitting silently and watching, voted yes. They had seen what a divided galaxy looked like when something serious happened. They had seen Torren's rest, and the Coalition standoff, and the 11 days it took humanity to solve a food crisis that would have paralyzed any other civilization for 2 years. They voted yes because the alternative was being alone when the next bad thing came, and no one wanted to be alone anymore. Ray attended the signing remotely. She watched the votes come in from her office on the flagship, with the same cup of tea she always seemed to have nearby, and she did not celebrate. She called her senior officers in afterward and told them the work was just beginning. Oran was not at the signing either. He was on the far side of the galaxy. The Solhari star map had been the last thing found in the sealed chamber. It was not like other star maps. It was not a navigation chart or a survey record. It was a message, drawn in careful lines, pointing to a region of space so far from the Council's territory that no one had ever bothered to look there. At the center of the indicated region, one star was marked with the Solhari symbol for continuance. Not home, not origin, the symbol for going on. Oran had presented it to Ray before the compact was signed. She had looked at it for a long time, and then authorized a full search mission before anyone could debate the budget. He traveled for 4 months on a human ship, which he found loud and warm and full of people who asked too many questions and made too much food, and somehow turned every meal into a shared occasion even in deep space. He found this exhausting and also oddly comforting. The human crew treated him like a colleague from the first day. They assigned him a bunk next to the research lab and left a cup of something warm outside his door every morning without being asked. The system they found at the end of the map had 4 planets. The third one was green and blue, active, alive. The ship's sensors resolved surface structures. Cities, but not like any they had seen. Long, low buildings that curved with the landscape, no straight lines, everything integrated into the ground as if it had grown there. And one structure on the highest point of the largest continent that their cameras resolved clearly. A transmitter, old but running. It had been sending a signal on a frequency no one had checked for a very long time. Contact took 2 weeks. The beings who answered were not what Oran expected. They were small, gray-blue, and spoke in a layered tonal language that the ship's translation system needed 6 days to crack. When it did, the first coherent sentence it produced was, "We did not think you would come this soon." "You knew we were coming?" Oran asked. "We knew someone would come," the being on the screen said. "We left the map for whoever found the warning stones first. We calculated it would be one of the older species." It paused for what seemed like a very long time. "You have a human on your ship." Oran blinked. "Several. We know. We have been monitoring your arrival since you entered the system." Another pause. "We have been waiting a very long time to see if our projections were correct. We ran the numbers on the blue world before we left. We concluded there were 2 possible outcomes. Either they would destroy themselves and the galaxy would continue as before, or they would survive their worst nature and become something necessary." The being's tonal voice carried something Oran's translator rendered as old relief. "Show us the human, please." Oran called over Nara, the ship's chief engineer, a young human woman with ink-stained hands who had been fixing the sensor array when the contact was established. She stepped into frame and looked at the screen. The Solhari elder stared at her for a long time. Then it said something in its own language that the translator rendered only partially, flagging several terms as culturally untranslatable. The partial translation read, "Correct, terrible, necessary, as projected." Nara looked at Iran. "Good or bad?" "I think both," Iran said. She considered that for a moment, then nodded like it was a reasonable answer. Back in the new Hall of Memory on the Compact's capital station, Dawn placed the original stone slab from Vel Sareth in its display case with her own hands. She stood in front of it for a long time. The ancient words were clear in the light, the warning that had started everything. Below it, in fresh script added by unanimous vote of the council, were words carved 2 days ago by a Duvari stone carver who had taken great care with every letter. They were right, and we were glad. Dawn put one hand briefly against the old stone. Then she turned and walked toward the window, where a dozen ships of a dozen different shapes moved quietly in the space outside, and beyond them the stars went on in every direction without end.